Tony Gosling needs no introduction. Former BBC journalist, he's an author and a broadcaster based in Bristol these days. Tomorrow you'll be able to hear not the BCFM Politics Show broadcast live via thisweek.org.uk or bilderberg.org. Welcome back, Tony. How are you?
Hi, Richie. Tomorrow we're going to be delving into city council corruption. I mean, for a lot of people, they just take it for granted that Westminster's corrupt. One of the things we like to do here is to look at the forensics, really, of how it works. A majority in a Green mayor, where it's actually he's not really a mayor anymore. It's more they call him a council leader because he's the leader of the biggest party. But they only just got in May taking over from Labour, Marvin Rees, who was the old-fashioned mayor then. And so what we'll be doing is looking into literally the same kind of corruption that you get at Westminster, but here in Bristol. And a lot of it has got to do with planning permission, the massive speculators just literally bribing. One of the biggest here in Bristol is the Bristol University, just literally bribing their way to getting planning permission. And if you and I could get the kinds of permissions that they get, we would be billionaires. Literally, one of these planning permission certificates will allow a piece of land that has been bought for, say, let's just pluck a figure out of the air, 500,000. With the planning permission that they get from that could then be 5, 6, 7, 8 million pounds worth of land overnight. So it's really a license to print money. And that's what a lot of our councils are doing, particularly big cities like Bristol behind the scenes. It's just literally captured by property speculators and by the super rich.
Tell me how they bribe them exactly. I understand what you've said to me. I imagine it's one of the greatest unreported scandals, at least by the mainstream media, maybe in history. I've heard about it going on up here. So they managed to secure land, these huge developers, for a song, for a gift, and then with the planning permission, the land becomes worth, as you said, it becomes worth, in some cases, millions and millions of pounds. Now, you said bribery. Is there a paper trail? Can it be proven that they explain it?
Yeah, there is a paper trail. And just as an example, what they've been doing here in our city, or their city as they like to see it, is they have put in these big planning applications. There's been one massive one right in the very centre of Bristol, on Bristol Bridge, which is where Brigstow, that's where Bristol got its name from. Over the Avon. And of course, it was a brilliant natural port. If anyone knows the city well, we've got the Avon Gorge, which protects Bristol from the sea, from invasion. And it's a beautiful natural port, much like some place like La Rochelle in France. You know,
yeah. This
is where the Templars loved to hang out back in medieval times. But anyway, the point is that, the land in the centre of Bristol has been derelict for many years. And what they've done is they put in an application for an absolutely audacious, vile, multi-story office project, right in the centre, that looks totally vile, is completely out of step with what was there when it was bombed in World War II. And also it's towering over the two neighbouring local churches, towering over all the other buildings. It's really just a Mickey take application. But by putting that in, what happens then is what they do is bit by bit, how can I put it? Everybody in the city and everybody in the planning system that even dares to speak up against it, or particularly if they act against it, in other words, they write something as part of the planning advice which says this is not a good idea, they're then bullied, they're targeted, bullied, and moved out of the way. And the bribery, I think, comes when you look at specific individuals like council chief executives, heads of planning, etc., that are then placed into those jobs and are given these wonderful public salaries because basically they're pliable. They know that in the future it's not just about this one planning application, it's about all the others.
So you think, so you think that granting these applications for these dubious developments which make prospectors very, very wealthy at the expense of local people, you think that after these things have happened, some people then can be seen to advance, you know, in terms of their career prospects improve?
What you're seeing a lot of the time is the revolving doors syndrome. So somebody who's been a planning consultant then sort of steps in as maybe a city councillor, or they're standing for office, they're in the city council. But anyway, this is one of the things
Right.
we'll be looking at in detail tomorrow. I'm not a massive expert, but there are some superb journalists here in the city.
I can't wait to hear it. Can I ask you a quick question, T? I can't wait to hear this tomorrow. I never miss an episode of your program, as you well know. So I'll be listening with all ears tomorrow.
Planning is boring. This is the trouble.
No, it's not boring. This is
but
hugely
actually,
important.
It's about the future look of our cities, and it's also about, well, what is it? Another massive office block we want? Is it another massive supermarket? Or is it public housing?
Well, here's the question, T. Here's the question I'm dying to ask you. I've been reading manifestos before the election, as you've been reading them, and we know that the current Labour government wants to make working a more flexible thing, which I believe one of the things that was meant to stay after the COVID scam was hybrid working from home, 3 days in the office, whatever, right? So why would anybody want to build a big office block in Bristol or anywhere else when working habits are changing and people don't want to be working in these office buildings?
Well, it's a good question. But the thing is that these are the prestige places that the businesses want to be. So they may be on the fringes of the city. They may be even in the outer inner circle, if you know what I mean, of the city.
Yes.
But to be right in the very centre of the city, this is the prestige address. You get exactly the same in London. You know, there are prestige addresses that businesses like to be located. What it does really is it just decants the, businesses from one part of the city, which isn't quite so prestigious, into the more prestigious. This is part of gentrification, really. The same sort of thing goes on with housing.
Yeah.
So, you get people pushed out. I've got a friend of mine now who's just been given his marching orders. He's moving about 2 miles out of the city centre because the whole area where he's living was quite a poor area. Now it's all being gentrified, and the landlords are selling. Or if they're not selling, they're upgrading their buildings and evicting tenants. So this is all about money. It's not about the people that live in the city and trying to plan it. I mean, all this started, as you probably know, after the Second World War, the Town and Country Planning Act. And now, of course, it's a system which is almost entirely captured. I mean, you're okay if you want to get planning permission for your gazebo or whatever it is on the back of your house, or conservatory. But when it comes to actually transforming a space, these people seem to have a total monopoly. And the reason that the university is so powerful here in Bristol is because they are the only people that seem to have a guaranteed income through these student loans and through these foreign students coming in. The universities are very cash rich. Now, that may not last, but these are the people that seem to be dictating most of the terms because they've got a good cash income. And the other thing to say is that the student flats are horrible. They're like little pigeonholes. The students have got hardly any space. It's like a little shoebox, and they're crammed in 7 to 1 tiny flat. And the reason for that is because the private equity firms and the hedge funds, the people who are doing these sorts of investments, know that they can literally double their money within 10 years. If they put them into student flats because they're so high intense. Anyway, for a lot of people, this is, no,
it isn't. Stop.
Boring planning, but
it is not. It is not. It's vital because the whole green agenda is built around it too. What you described there about the students sounds very much to me like human settlement zones. Is that the plan it's not the plan for me. I'm nearly 50. You're only a few years older than I am. I'm lucky enough we have our own home in Salford, so it's not the plan for me. But is it the plan for the 20-somethings of today that eventually they will live in boxes, in high rises?
It's all about own nothing and be happy. The idea that you own your own home, which is actually quite an important part of a family's raison d'etre. I mean, literally, the ability to know that you're looking after a place which you can hand on to your kids, I think they're trying to get rid of it. They really are. I mean, we've got the biggest land ownership. Kevin Cahill, the author of Who Owns Britain and Who Owns Ireland, was telling me this recently, that we've ever had. Up until about 10 years ago, then the rates of home ownership started to fall because people are finding it more and more difficult to pay mortgages because their disposable income has been decreased for all sorts of reasons. COVID was one reason, but generally speaking, ever since the 1980s, our disposable income has been falling. And so what we're finding is that people cannot afford to buy a house or even keep repayments up in many cases. And so the idea is the financial institutions will start to own homes, the banks, the pension funds will start to own buildings, and we will just simply be tenants in those buildings. That's the way Rachel Reeves is heading, because she's about to announce, I'm quite certain, there's been various pre-warnings of it, of big increases in inheritance tax, which means that if you try and hand your home onto your kids, if they haven't got that big nest egg, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands in the bank, then they just simply have to sell the home and move into rented accommodation in order to pay the death duty. So that's where we're heading with this. They don't want to have people owning their own homes because it gives the family such security.
It does indeed. It gives you a bit of independence from the state. It gives you something to build your life around, and ultimately to build your later life when you're not working around. You're listening to Tony Gosling. We'll come back to that later because that's hugely important. The taxation, Rachel Reeves. Tony, former BBC journalist, reporter, one of the few journalists left in the UK today. He talked already about tomorrow's programme, not the BCFM politics programme. Going to be talking about planning. It's hugely interesting. Listen to it. Now, what a week it's been. I suppose the most covered story, understandably, this week has been the events in Southport where horrifically 3 young girls were stabbed to death. A young man is in custody. He's been charged with it. A number of other children were injured. There have been riots and demonstrations, not only in Southport, but in Hartlepool, in Manchester, and London, I believe, where a lot of arrests happened last night. The chap was named today as Axel Rudakubana. He turns 18 in 6 days, so the judge decided to name him. I think the judge also said he wanted to name him because the judge is concerned about disinformation and misinformation. Now, I invited our listeners earlier, before you came on, to send in comments and questions for you specifically on all of these stories around Southport. So we will stop so I can put questions from listeners, not from me, to you, because there's so much around this. So before we talk about the response from the public, let's talk about it happening. This is pure. I said we wouldn't do this, but now I'm kind of desperately keen to do it. How does 17-year-old kid, if he did do it, because innocent until proven guilty, how does it happen that somebody loses it to the point where they find themselves in a club, in an institution, in a school, and they are slashing at children with a knife? How does that happen, Tony?
Well, look, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has just stood on the steps of Downing Street instructing the nation not to speculate about exactly what we're about to talk about. So, of course, we will speculate because you have to. This is the job of the press, is to use educated guesswork. Now, as soon as an incident like this comes to the what happened this morning, which is the charging of Axel, this 17-year-old, things do change in how it can be reported. But certainly there are some serious questions about why these girls were not protected, and what is it that protects kids in this sort of situation? Because up until now, his identity was protected. The law was protecting the guy. For some, this is because the law says that if you're a child, then you're below the late ages of legal responsibility, that sort of thing, that we want to protect you into the future. And of course, there's a certain amount of logic to that. But the thing is that the girls weren't protected. And what is it that's supposed to protect them? Well, what's supposed to protect them is the rule of law and also the culture. So that if anybody sees anything or does anything which is out of the ordinary. So, for example, just as one example, the guy Brenton Tarrant that went in New Zealand and shot all the people in the mosque, there were plenty of signs beforehand down in Dunedin where he was going to a gun club, and he was actually reported to the authorities in New Zealand.
Yes, he was.
They were saying that this guy's a nutcase, something needs to be done about it. Keep a very close eye on him. And of course, they didn't keep a close eye on him, and he went on to carry out the massacre in the mosques. You get exactly the same sort of thing going on with the Manchester Arena alleged bomber. And I still call him alleged because I'm not convinced that it was actually him that planted this bomb personally. I'm not sure. But you got exactly the same with that. So people reporting him to the anti-terror hotline. We had also all the indications that his father was very closely related to an MI6 group that was attempting to infiltrate and assassinate Gaddafi in Libya before eventually that happened. So a lot of these individuals and characters have got warning signs going on in the background. So I would imagine there's a similar thing with this young 17-year-old, that things were going on. There's another aspect to all of this which gets pointed out hardly ever, and that is that, and we can speculate, there was a question that needs to be asked, because Starmer is saying, no, the time for questioning is not yet. No, the time for questioning is now. And of course, there will be questions being asked all around that local area and all around the country about what caused this. We're not idiots. We don't have to sort of sit there and just simply take this and not speculate, because there is a certain amount of educated guesswork we could do here, which isn't going to hurt anybody. So, for example, many of these killers, I can't remember the guy's name, but it was up in Nottingham, and he was convicted recently, and he was convinced that he was being manipulated by MI5, and even went down to visit MI5.
That's right.
Was on antidepressant drugs. Now, these do have an effect of tipping people over the edge quite often. And so was this lad on these sorts of antidepressant drugs? We don't know. It's a perfectly reasonable question to ask, and one to which journalists, I think, that's the sort of questions they could have been asking anyway, up until the guy was charged. Was he on these drugs? And asking these questions to people who knew him, people in that local area, people maybe even who knew him when he was living in Cardiff. But the main thing from my point of view is, as a journalist looking at this, is a news blackout on who it was that had been arrested, who it was that was being accused, etc. This allowed the far right, particularly this. I mean, they say that the English Defence League was abolished, but it's not. It's still around. Tommy Robinson is still around, and these people, what they were doing is they were spreading these false rumours without bothering to check. In fact, as soon as I looked at the rumours when I saw them on Monday, I was thinking, God, this is really, is that, is this real? And you can't be, and I wasn't spreading it myself, other than to say that there seems to be misinformation coming in to fill the vacuum. And so that's what I've been discussing with some other journalists about. If you create this massive information vacuum, you say things like, oh, we can't think, we're not allowed to ask questions, we're not allowed to speculate. Well, that's the press's job. Certainly up until the guy's charged, that's what we should be doing. And so what's happened here is an opportunistic far right. Racists have just come in with a fake Islamic name and said, oh, it's a Muslim. And so there's been an attack on a mosque as a result. But that wouldn't have happened if the police and the press had been on the case, first of all, interrogating what the circumstances were around the person who'd come and done this attack. And secondly, the police could very easily be issuing statements immediately to scotch rumours saying, no, it's not this person. And they could be doing that nationally on public television. But they haven't done that. And this is where I think these police press officers really need to up their game. If they're going to speak out, and you know what we've seen as a result of this. I don't know if you've heard Starmer's speech, but he was saying just now, oh, we're going to have to introduce facial recognition all around the country, special squad of facial recognition. This is an excuse to bring in draconian new measures. And he says, oh, we don't want to bring any new laws in. No, but what you're going to try and do is to have more and more clamp down on civil liberties, because the police and the press were irresponsible in this occasion and allowed a massive great hole for the far right to jump into.
Let me push back, because the police and the press are not here to defend themselves, obviously, so allow me to push back. The misinformation was instantaneous. So there was absolutely no opportunity for the press or for the police to say, we've had a look into this. He's a kid who was born in Cardiff. He's not a Muslim. His parents come from Rwanda. This is what we know. People need to calm down. Now, that's what the press or the police could have done, but they had no time, Tony, because the misinformation was online immediately, instantaneously, and that is being used as the pretext or the excuse to pressurize social media companies to basically shut down completely. I mean, that's what they want, I believe. Whenever
Sorry, look, you're
jump
wrong.
in.
Actually, the police did release this, but only when they were pressed by some journalists. So there is time. I mean, if the police are on the case, they're watching what's being said online. They're supposed to be apparently stalking us on Facebook all over the place. Yeah. But there is time. Of course there is. You just go on. As soon as you see some rumour like this starting to circulate, you literally go on to the next news bulletin.
They did nothing.
You call BBC up, you say, we've got a press conference on this, and you start saying, well, this person is being suggested as, and it's not this person. So would people please not just come up with these random names and also try to turn it into some sort of Islamophobic hate campaign.
Very good counterpoint. Hang on.
If they were a live, working, on the ball press office, but a lot of the people who are working in these jobs, they're very risk averse, and they say, well, hang on, what if we get into trouble if we do this? But they should be fighting an information war out there to try and make sure that rumours like this don't get and in a way, it may actually suit certain people within the establishment to allow these kinds of riots to take place, and those rumours to get some credence. So, but the police need to try and stop that if they're working in the public interest, which often I doubt.
Well, that's a very good counterpoint. I agree with that. I don't think it would make a lot of difference to many of those who consume alternative or alt-right media. It wouldn't matter to them, I don't believe, if the police came out and said, listen, we've had a look into it. It's not a Muslim. It's got nothing to do with a guy who came on a boat last week. He didn't. He's not an MI6 guy who's been monitored for terrorism. He's a kid. And, that's what we've done. I don't think it would make any difference. So my next question to you is, and listeners want me to put this to you, what is your response as a proper journalist? Not blowing smoke up your arse, you are. What is your response then to the likes of Paul Mason, veteran of the BBC and Channel 4? He reckons Russia is behind a lot of this stuff online. Is it?
No.
Why not?
No, it's much more likely to be MI5 because the security services are very much infiltrated, and special branch love to infiltrate these far-right groups. And the football hooligan groups as well. That's one of their specialities, because they like to be able to sort of command a mob, to be able to click their fingers and say, we want a mob here at this point, at this time to do X. I can remember when I was frequenting the rave scene in the noughties and going along to a rave here in Bristol City Centre, an area that's now been built on, lots of housing on there now. And we turned up to this rave, fantastic, really enjoyed it. And she did a bit of filming there. And I was saying, well, where's the police? There's no. One of the women who's helping with organising it, one of the sort of steward type people, said, "We don't like it when the police don't turn up. We always think something else might be going to happen," and it did. So around about 3 a.m, a whole bunch of lads turned up with silly hats on, white hats on, and baseball bats. And she was absolutely right. So whether the police knew that these guys were turning up, these thugs, to try and basically beat people up and smash up the rave, I would suggest they almost certainly did. Somebody in the police did, because there were no police there, and even when the police were called, they didn't turn up to the rave. And so that's the sort of thing that experience that tells me that the police do, and particularly along with the security services, do like to infiltrate groups like the far-right groups, Tommy Robinson's group. I would suggest even Tommy Robinson could be unwittingly, or maybe even wittingly, working very closely with the security services, because they see him as a useful idiot, a kind of nutter magnet.
They might do. A lot of our listeners who love listening to your show on Friday, they get very upset, and I think they have a good point, when they hear the term far-right being bandied around, because they say, Richie, I am concerned about an influx of migrants into my town, and I'm getting this now from Irish listeners. I'm getting it from listeners in the northwest of the UK. They say public services decimated deliberately. In comes an influx of migrants. When I dare ask, how is this logical to allow so many migrants come into a town, I'm accused of being racist or far right or a Tommy Robinson brigade moron. Yeah. I'm sick of it, they say. I'm not far right, I'm not racist. I'm entitled to say what the bloody hell is going on. What do you say?
Well, I agree. You are. And saying that these are two completely separate things. You don't have to be a racist, although some are, to say that we've got too much migration. I think most of the population think that there's too much migration. This was one of the main reasons for the Brexit vote, for example. So, there are plenty of people. In fact, I live in St Paul's in Bristol, which has got a big West Indian community. Many of the West Indians are saying, it's got totally out of hand.
Yeah.
So they can see that the number of illegal and legal migrants in the country is just got out of hand. It's quite true. It has. And this, I think, has been organised really by organised crime and the European Union in hand. as a sort of punishment for Brexit, bringing the small boats across. The idea that none of the British Navy or forces of any sort can stop this is just beyond a joke. They're constantly boarding and arresting boats in other parts of the world. There was one recently in the Mediterranean, which the Royal Navy boarded and arrested everybody. Look, these people, there is a deliberate attempt to bring in mass migration in order to create this kind of race war. Now, I don't know if you remember, that the Manson murders in the 1960s in the States, and that whole issue around the race war that the CIA and FBI were trying to create there. They want poor white people and poor black people fighting each other. And having mass migration is a great way to destroy the unions by driving wages right down, to destroy services, and also to keep house prices up. So that's why I think we've got mass migration. And I'm not a racist, but I don't believe that the migrants are in any way benefiting Britain. In fact, there was a report recently saying that it's a massive disadvantage financially. The people it does advantage, of course, are the usual suspects, the super rich and the elite, who just get loads and loads of cheap labour, and they can get rid of much of their workforce by employing people from abroad. Simple, very simple. But no, they're not racists. Your people who are writing in, I very much doubt, are racists. Yes, there's a massive migrant problem, and we need to sort it. We need to sort it straight away.
I'm going to shock and amaze you.
Race at the bottom, really, by having so many people, unskilled labourers, are prepared to work for next to nothing coming into the country. And I can understand why they do it, but it's the authorities here, really, that are to blame, not them.
100%. I'm going to shock and amaze you now. And we're never going to agree on this, so, I mean, you can have the final word on it. I don't necessarily believe that the likes of Tommy Robinson and some of the other heavyweights, I don't believe hatred is their motivation either. I believe their motivation is grift, it's money, it's fame, it is followers, it is turning up to Trafalgar Square and speaking to 20,000 adoring people. I really do believe that. I don't believe hatred is the motivation there. And that's the really sad thing about it. So those morons are given the publicity by the print and the broadcast media, and the great majority of people who have genuine grievances with the madness of the migration policy, they are never heard from on TV or radio, and they are painted with this brush, or they are tarred with this label of being racist when they're not racist. Hold that thought, T, for a minute. Messages piling in here. Andy did TV and radio at Salford. I met Andy, Scouse Andy. Richie, he's been listening to you with great interest. The Starmer press conference, a new anti-violence police unit, facial recognition techniques, as Tony said, and a crackdown on misinformation on social media. If you didn't already know, 1984 is here. You will now. Here's one from Carlos before you come back in. Thank you, Carlos. He says, the Stormtrooper has targeted the symptoms and not the cause of all of the unrest. And that says it all, says Carlos. Problem, reaction, solution. So then, T, if you're right, and I think you are right, that everything we are seeing is to, all the unrest that is deliberately fostered. It's deliberately fostered so that they can bring in the crackdown on free speech, the crackdown on free movement, all of that. Well, then it's not unfair of some people to speculate, well, maybe this kid was put up to doing what he did in Southport. Now, I'm not saying I believe that, T. I am in no way saying I believe that, but you and I know, MK Ultra, you and I know other things have happened over the years where men, I think Mark Chapman is one, men have been induced or seduced into doing things that later on they have no memory of.
Well, possibly, although he may well have some memory, but he just may not have any chance to express that. Yeah. I mean, just think about people like Shamima Begum. The whole thing was totally groomed on Facebook. Her trip with her friends over to join ISIS, they were all groomed by Canadian intelligence services on Facebook. And then all those posts were, of course, funnily enough, deleted. Yeah. And she was met at the airport in Turkey. She was given the money to fly over there, met at the airport in Turkey, taken down to Syria. I mean, this is the sort of thing that's going on out there. And goodness, I mean, another aspect of this I don't think I've seen anybody else talking about, is potentially these violent video games. This is something which a lot of youngsters, when they're at that testosterone level in their sort of later teens, get really into this stuff completely obsessively. And it just programs this kind of violence into them. Like, the more violent you can be in your little silly game, the better. But then doesn't that have a possibility of bringing itself out into the real world? Potentially with if you're on antidepressants or something like that, that's likely to happen.
Yeah.
The other aspect, of course, is Taylor Swift being involved at this class, and that is a potential motive for him. But Taylor Swift has been accused by one of the Irish, I can't remember the guy's name, Irish singers, as being demonic and satanic. And I've no idea whether that's really true. There's certainly some weird imagery, not quite as bad as the French Olympics, but it might be that he's just decided that he's going to go and do some job to get rid of these demonic stuff by using a knife in a place like that, if it is him indeed. So there's all sorts of other potential motives, and I think it's quite right that the press, particularly before maybe not after, speculates about what those motives might be. Violent video games, I think, are totally, I don't think they should be, allowed. So maybe some sort of, over a certain age. But then, of course, when you allow over a certain age, the youngsters always get hold of it. It's like having Facebook accounts and this sort of thing. It's almost impossible to regulate. So that's another aspect of society. But what we really need to keep those kids safe is to have a culture which doesn't allow this kind of glorification of violence, and also the sorts of situations on the streets where kids feel that they have to carry a knife in order to survive on the streets. So that means reopening youth clubs. And most important of all, I think, Richie, is giving kids a future. Many kids now don't have a future. They don't see a future in gainful employment. And they don't see a future in work except being exploited at very low wages. So these are all aspects which may have played in here and may not.
Yeah, there's also a very big thing happening, and it's unprecedented in human history. It really is unprecedented. And very few, if any, people are talking about it. And it's the isolation of younger people. Younger people, and I hate to, it sounds so patronizing saying younger people, but they do not have relationships in the same way that we had, and I don't mean sexual or romantic relationships, I mean relationships. They just do not. There is an avalanche of studies out there by some good actors and some dubious actors, but there's an avalanche of studies out there about their habits and how they live and how they interact with other people. To me, sounds demonic and unimaginable. It's almost exclusively online. It's very rarely these days in the flesh, meeting people, having to be, being in groups of people, having to accept your ideas or your arguments being kicked around or shot down, having the piss taken out of you, kind of growing a kind of a robustness. There's an energy exchange when people are together in the present, in the real sense. And they don't have that. Increasingly, they do not have it. And it must be playing havoc with them somehow, Tony, that they don't. Maybe sociopathy is a big thing amongst younger people. That's a controversial thing to say. Maybe a lot of younger people are growing up and they see other people maybe as maybe not being real. You get what I'm saying, T? There's all that going on.
Well, I think I do. There's a sort of detachment.
Yeah.
To a lot of youth. But there are also some fantastic young people who really do get it. I think the difference between the generation that's growing up now and my generation is there was a sort of understanding in the background of Christian culture that you just adhered to these basic values of love thy neighbor, of put others before yourself. That was a general thing. That seems to have gone in the last 40 years, say probably since the Thatcher era. Now it's become dog eat dog. It's almost like a survival of the fittest world out there. And actually, the way the economy is set up and the housing situation is set up and the job situation is set up, it does really feel like you're being trained to be a dog, to eat other dogs in the workplace and in the rest of your life. And so, I grew up in an era where it was very, very easy. When I left school, there were jobs everywhere. And if you didn't like a boss, you could leave it. This makes an enormous difference to people's just general well-being and sense of who everyone else around them is. So that, to me, is one of the massive changes that there's been just in my lifetime, is really what it's done is it's almost turned people against each other. It's like the natural way of doing things is to compete rather than to cooperate. And I was brought up in a a socialist country, where most of the infrastructure was all in public hands. We've now moved to selling all that off so that the enormous, you're looking at, there was a BBC news report this morning on the RSPCA. The RSPCA is finding it may have to close down many of its animal homes simply because of the cost of living, the bills for all the electricity and gas and water, etc., that they use have all gone up so much that this charity is now finding it almost impossible to survive. Now, I'm no massive great fan of the RSPCA, although I think they do a lot of good work. But this is what's happened, is the racketeers have moved in on our infrastructure. Our gas, our water, our transportation, our telecoms and all that are now run by racketeers. And that's why I think actually is what's really behind the war in Ukraine and war in Gaza, is because we're living in a West which has completely failed economically. We can't compete with the rest of the world. But what we can still do is tax houses, tax cars, tax the basic things that people need to live on. So that really does, I think, defeat and demoralize the mass of the population. And it's changed massively the character of the world we're living in today, Richie.
Yeah, it has, mate. That's excellent. Yeah, I didn't explain myself very well. You did a good job of it there. I think the more they spend online, looking at a screen or a phone, the more they spend making TikTok videos, uploading them for gratitude or gratification, the more time they are having online and not physical relationships. I think there's a danger that people living like that will come to question the reality of people in the physical world. Again, I can't explain. It's something I read years ago, and I can't remember who I read saying it, but a very good writer said years ago when smartphones became a thing, he said, watch for, sociopathy. So sociopaths often question whether their victims are in fact real people, whether they're actually real
maybe,
or not.
You and I should have a real pint one day.
A real pint, mate. Yeah, I've known you since the days of Talk Radio Europe in Spain, and we've never physically met. Tony Gosling is our guest. I want to ask Tony about Iran. Tony was on Press TV last night giving his thoughts, his educated opinions on the situation in the Middle East after the very senior Hamas politician and, of course, negotiator Ismail Haniyeh was murdered by the Israelis only a few days ago. We'll talk to Tony about that in a minute, but I want to read some more comments out. Thisweek.org.uk, Bilderberg.org. Tony has written some brilliant books, including The Traders of Arnhem. Can't recommend it highly enough. It's so prescient, the book, to the events of today. Rob says, Tony spot on with everything. And then he asks, is it chemtrails? He doesn't believe him. We don't have to get into that now, Rob. Hi to Neil. In my opinion, says Neil, far-right lexicon is being used as a trigger phrase. It's a trigger phrase. For some reason, far left is seldom heard. Most of us in the right are just normal folks. Using trigger phrases perpetuates the populist divide, and that enables the hidden hand to try and dominate mankind. But of course, Neil is right. Terminology like far right and far left and liberal conservatives is used to divide people and to pigeonhole people. Absolutely. Len says, could it be demonic possession in Southport? Plain and simple, demonic entities from the spirit world that made him do what he did. Tony, one of my old pals, I've not interviewed him for a long time, is Father Vince Lampert. He is a Catholic priest, and he is legitimately the only Catholic priest in the United States authorized to perform exorcisms. If Father Vince was here today, he would say, I know he would, that while extremely, extremely rare, demonic possession in manifesting itself in that way, somebody going to kill people, it's not unheard of. There you are. It's out there from Len.
I think it's possible. It's certainly possible. Maybe the procedures by which somebody comes to be in that situation where they are possessed. I mean, this is pretty scary stuff. It's not supposed to be, it's not on lexicon. This the sort of thing isn't supposed to be real. But I certainly believe it's feasible that someone can be possessed. Now, there's ways to encourage that through use of hallucinogenic drugs, things like that, and also through hideous rituals when the kids are very small. Let's not forget, Rwanda did have a genocide where the parents are from, and I would presume that they would have sort of had some sort of experience of that, given their age and his age, and so there may be some connection with that too.
Excellent stuff. Tony Gosling. Now you're on Press TV. I'm glad Press TV is going strong and doing well. Of course, it was an abomination that Ofcom kicked it out of the UK and did the same to RT. An absolute outrage against journalism. Whether you agreed with the Press TV presenters or their guests, irrelevant. It did a lot of great journalism, and plurality is very important. It's going out the window. By the way, T, before I ask you about, I'm always doing this. Before I ask you about Iran, what about this dipstick who has a big share in GB News? He's going to take over the Telegraph newspaper now. Another slice or another cut, death by 1,000 cuts to media plurality. What do you reckon?
I don't really know very much about them. I do know the Barclay twins that used to own the Telegraph. I know a bit about them, but I have no idea. But I mean, it seems bizarre that it was, I don't know how much money's changed hands, but it was apparently very little, because these big newspapers now are finding it very difficult to pay the bills, whether it's because they still have offices in central London that cost a lot of money, and it's simply that most people want to read it for free online. I'm not sure, but I don't know who this person is who's taken the Telegraph over, I have to say.
Yeah, right? It's going to be Paul Marshall. He's a knight of the realm. He's a hedge fund guy. He has a huge stake in GB News, and he's going to buy the Spectator. Again, you've opened up the discussion. That's brilliant what you said there. Yes, nobody is buying newspapers. I think what he wants to do with the Spectator, and they want to buy the Telegraph too. They want to get the Spectator and the Telegraph. The Daily and Sunday Telegraph newspapers. That's right. He wants the Spectator, the Daily and the Sunday Telegraph. Because I reckon what he's going to do is he's going to make podcasts out of the presenters, or podcasters out of them. And he's going to go, yeah, I reckon so. Anyway, look.
The most successful newspaper in Britain at the moment is Metro, and it's free. So the idea is, if you're a newspaper proprietor and you want to survive, you have to get rid of the cover price, so people can just pick it up whenever they want for nothing. I mean, let's face it, most of it is propaganda anyway, so why should we have to pay for it? Yeah. And you just survive then on putting ads in there. So that's how Metro's survived all over London and some other cities, and they're doing extremely well. They're leaping ahead of all the other newspapers. They're just refusing, I think, And also, by the way, Metro's free online. But it's got plenty of ads on there and quite annoying little advert things. But at least you can read the thing. This idea that Murdoch started with the Times of trying to get a paywall so everyone has to pay to read online, I don't think it's really a runner, because people don't then share the stuff. The whole point of having a decent newspaper is that people are sharing your material, and you can't share an article that you can't see. So the Metro model seems to be the best one to me, and I don't know why all of the media aren't trying to go along that route.
Yeah, well said. Mail Online making millions as well. Susan Grumman is listening. Good evening, Susan. Good morning. I think Susan is in the States. She believes that 99% of terrorist attacks are programming by the parasites, she says, MK Ultra, etc. Violent games could add to it, she says. They follow the same program. Now, the Israeli government never admits, it's kind of like the former queen, I suppose, of the UK, never complain, never explain. So they don't come out and directly admit that they have attacked or that they've murdered or assassinated anybody. But the Israelis have assassinated Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. Most importantly, Ismail Haniyeh, who was a chief negotiator for Hamas. My listeners believe, they're telling me anyway, that Israel has absolutely no intention of brokering a permanent ceasefire, and that Israel doesn't give a damn about hostages. Israel wants to continue to prosecute the genocide in Gaza until there's nothing left of Gaza or of the Palestinians. You've been following it, of course, closely. Iran, if we're to believe this, the Iranian leaders have been saying that Israel will pay. The press is reporting that the Iranians, Khamenei has basically said that Israel should be attacked, or that Iran should attack Israel. How do you see it, T? Is my audience right? Does Israel want to carry on with what's going on in Gaza indefinitely, or is there any prospect at all for a ceasefire?
Well, look, I'm biased. I'm a Quaker, and I don't like to see war. In fact, I think what's going on here is, look at the timing of all this. First of all, this new president, after the last one mysteriously died in a helicopter crash, which certainly to me looked very, very suspicious. But maybe just one simple missile brought it down. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians had just said, well, we're not going to make a big issue of it. The new guy has just been inaugurated, the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, a new president, so Ismail Haniyeh was the Gazan Hamas guy, Palestinian, was over in Iran from Qatar, which is where he's normally based. But it's not the first time he's been there. So there have been plenty of opportunities potentially to assassinate him over in Tehran before. So you have to ask why now? Well, obviously, it's a message to the new president of Iran. Look, we can just blow up anyone we feel like it, and we have the guts to do it, or the audacity, the stupidity. Actually, audacity was the word that BBC used to describe it. I shouldn't use that word because it almost, if someone was something sort of
legitimizes it. Yeah.
You know, it's a brave thing to do or inventive. No, this is really cowardly, actually. Cowardly. It's not brave, it's cowardly because you're doing it by remote control by some drone or whatever. And it's not inventive because it's what they always do. So that's not really the right word, audacious, to describe it, BBC, which they did on The World Tonight last night. But the other thing in the timing of all of this, of course, is Netanyahu's just back from America. So it just seems obvious to me that the Yanks have given the green light to all of this. And it wasn't just this. There was also attack on Syria and attack on Lebanon. On Lebanon. Fuad Shukr was assassinated in Beirut, who's one of the Hezbollah people. Also, so the Americans are basically saying to Netanyahu, yes, you can do this. Yes, you can do this. But the thing is, he's not supported by the world. He's not even really supported by his own people, although many of them, a majority, probably at least 75%, are racists in Israel.
That's very unfair, Tony. That's really unfair that. We don't know that. We can't say that.
I do. No, I take quite a lot of attention to these things. And,
so do I.
I think you're talking about roughly 75% of Israelis are racists and they want to see the Palestinians gone. They're extremely, they are extremely racist. They're brought up to be racist, Richie. They're told that God wants them to be racist. God's given them this land and that these people are from the devil. That's basically what they're brought up, many Israelis, to think that. And, they have to work quite hard, I think, to be normal civilized people, to work against that programming from such a young age.
Yeah, I know a lot about the programming. I mean, I've interviewed Jewish Americans. I've interviewed Israelis over the years. You're right to say that they're thought they are the special ones and that the land is theirs. And I get all of that. But I do take issue with the racism thing, or that 75% of them. I don't know. I'm not sure about it. Over the years, I used to interview hardline Zionists on radio in Spain and when I was doing TV in London. And I was often amazed at how many Israelis living in Tel Aviv or living in Jerusalem would either phone in or text in or email in to say they're not in favour of the occupation, that they're in favour of a two-state solution. Many of them would say pre-67 borders. So I suppose what I'm taking issue with is not that there are racists in Israel. There are. But I don't want to believe that 75% of them would support today.
I'm standing by what I'm saying. I think that's roughly the percentage of Israelis who do particularly dislike Palestinians for their race, and they see themselves as other. Not, but the thing is that Netanyahu is very unpopular amongst that 75%.
Yes, he is.
They see him as totally mismanaging this war, and they would rather it was brought to a halt and that the hostages were returned through negotiation. But Netanyahu just decides he wants to pursue the war because he's trying to stay in office, and he realizes if he's out of office. It reminds me of the English Civil War, where you had Oliver Cromwell who'd beaten the king. The king was in prison here. I think he was in the Isle of Wight. He was being kept in prison. And it dawned on Cromwell, look, if I allow the king to survive, if I don't chop his head off, he's going to come for me. And that's exactly what is going through Netanyahu's mind. He knows that if he's out of office, that the new political class, whoever it is that takes over, and the new wave of far-right politicians, whoever they are going to come for him, and they're going to scapegoat him, and he's going to be in jail. So that's why I think he's pursuing the war in the way in the way that he is. I mean, you just remember Gaza now, we're talking about scabies and lice, the kids having skin diseases. There was an attack yesterday or the day before, I think, on Greek Orthodox Church there that we're not hearing very much about. What we do hear a lot about, though, is the attack on the Golan Heights at the weekend, which was the sort of beginning of this latest round of horrors. And we were being told that this was perpetrated by Hezbollah. The BBC is saying that sort of thing. And Jonathan Cook, who I'm pleased to say lives here in Merry Bristol, did a fantastic article about that. He's saying, well, look, you're talking about a few the Druze kids killed by a supposed Hezbollah bomb, which might well have been just for the American public's benefit, planted there and sent over by the Israelis instead. But what about all the children that the Israelis have been killing for the last 8-9 months, again and again, and particularly specifically targeting children? And so this was the backdrop to this assassination. But what I think is an interesting line to look at is this concept that you can win a battle, as the Netanyahu seems to think he can, with the entire Persian and Arab world, which, by the way, are the indigenous people. He's not. His family's Polish. By this decapitation strategy, the idea of just killing the leaders. Well, actually, it doesn't really make any difference if you kill the leaders, and it would be the same if it was Russia, I think. You know, if Putin was to be assassinated, you would find a whole queue of people with very similar ideas to Putin about the best way to defend Russia from this maniac West. And the same is true, I think, in Iran. And with Hamas, is that by killing these leaders, they're not actually achieving anything. The decapitation strategy is really just a strategy of chaos. It's nihilistic. It's designed to cause a demoralization. But it's not actually going to change things, because there's a different attitude, I think, amongst the Iranian population, the people, and their leaders, in that the leaders are just people. They're just like everybody. They're the equivalent, really, just as, say, a nurse on the front line, or a teacher on the front line, or a soldier on the front line. That when one of those are killed, they hurt every bit as much as when one of the leaders is killed. So there's a much more egalitarian structure, I think, in these more resilient countries that are coming under attack from the Anglo-Zionist empire. That's why I don't think this decapitation strategy is really effective. And I think maybe it betrays the fact that they're afraid that maybe the Arab countries, the Hezbollah and the Iranians, etc., might decide that they want to start assassinating leaders in the Western world and in Israel, because actually that would make an enormous difference. There is a very much a concentration of, say, for example, in Saudi Arabia and the monarchy there. They have a very fragile government, which is, if a few people were to be taken out at the top, it might actually change massively. But that's not going to happen on the other side. I hope you can see what I'm saying here. This decapitation strategy that Netanyahu is going for, I don't think it's going to work at all.
You said something a few minutes ago, I've got to take issue with it. You said that the Israelis are deliberately killing children. Now, hang on before you jump in with 2 feet. I'm not going to say I don't agree with that. But I have listeners who are sympathetic to Israel. They are more sympathetic to Israel than they are to the plight of the Palestinian people. I know that's hard to believe listening to this program, but it is true, because they are in touch. And they firmly believe that when Israel says we do not target children, the Palestinian authority or Hamas is in the habit of hiding out in places where children are, and this is why it happens. That's what they say. You're rolling your eyes. I can see it through the cybersphere. But as some of our listeners, I would imagine more, particularly in the last few years, more than I would have ever imagined. Their sympathies lie, particularly because of the immigration problems in this country. I think that has something to do with it, even though there are no Palestinians coming into the UK. But there is that, I suppose, suspicion of the Islamist lifestyle and of the Islamic culture. There is a bit of that going on. Some of my listeners, they say we have more in common with people in Israel than we would do with people in Palestine or people in Pakistan or wherever. So Israel says we do not attack or go looking to kill children. It's a natural consequence of what Hamas does. And they're sticking to that statement. What say you?
Actually, Islamic culture is rather similar to old-fashioned British culture. In fact, I think it was Rowan Williams, when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, pointed out, have a look at Sharia law. It's very similar to the law here in Britain used to be hundreds of years ago under church law. And, for example, you won't find usury. This is the charging of interest in the Muslim countries like Iran. What they have is very strict rules about banking. So you can't charge interest. You can charge a fee for lending the money, but you're not allowed to charge interest, and certainly not compound interest, which is what we do here. And also, they hang bankers in Iran. I haven't seen any bankers hanged in Britain recently.
I don't want anybody hanged. Hang on a second. This is outrageous. Hang on. I've seen you on Press TV over the years, and to be fair to you, you are no lick spittle. You're not. You go on and you give an honest opinion. You're not going to like this, but I'm going to say it anyway. 5.5 years ago, a man was hung in Iran because he had drunk alcohol more than 6 times. That is not a lie. I spent 4 months trying to verify the story before I would go to air with it, because Iran is not the biggest problem in the world in terms of the global order and in terms of world peace. Iran isn't. It is not. Iran is not the aggressor. I'm well aware of it. But Jesus, Mary and Joseph, I don't want to live in Iran. They hang people there for drinking. I'm not saying it's a regular thing, but one guy was hung, verified. That's basket case mentality, T. Do you not understand why some people in the West might look at that and go, fuck that,
Well, okay, we have a basket case mentality in many ways as well.
We do.
For example, this attempt to say that women can have an abortion right up till the time of birth, which is another recent idea. I mean, this to me is completely insane.
I agree.
And barbaric. So look, I don't think the best thing to do is put your own house in order. Stop judging everybody else. And this is what we see all the time from the Western press, the Western media, all the time is, Putin has to go. This idea of Starmer this afternoon talking about we must restrict disinformation on social media. Well, what about blaming Russia for everything on the national media? Well, that's okay, apparently. What about blaming Iran for everything on the national media? That's okay, it seems. And that sort of thing can stoke a world war, by the way.
Yes.
And so I think a little bit of speculation on social media is nowhere near as damaging and dangerous as some of the lies, the weapons of mass destruction level lies that we get on the mainstream press. And of course, they're supposed to be independent, but they're not. They just trot out the same old press releases to take us to war time and time again. People like Tony Benn and Robin Cook really spoke out about this. They're no longer with us, sadly, and we desperately need voices in Parliament and in our national press that are prepared to say things like that. Look, you can't just go to war on a lie. In fact, Julian Assange, one of his most famous speeches, he built around this whole idea that if we knew the truth, we wouldn't go to war. So, Starmer and others criticising social media, what's happened is there's so many lies coming out from the mainstream press. People are driven onto social media in desperation to try and get a little bit of truth and actually to spread a bit of truth. And so what we really need to do is get our journalism and our national media in order through, and there's a lot of attacks on the BBC, by the way, over things like Hugh Edwards. I see the BBC as very important still. And I'm not entirely sure about what's happened with him and whether he's been entrapped. God knows. I don't know the ins and outs of it. He's certainly been sort of
well, he's pled guilty. He's pled guilty.
But what does that mean? It doesn't mean. It means he may have been persuaded by a solicitor or bullied into. There's plea bargaining going on all the time behind the scenes now. So we don't know what actually really happened. And if he's pled guilty, it won't come out in court. Maybe that's just what he wanted to avoid. We don't know. But the fact is, if you get rid of the BBC, what you're going to get is pure private press. You're going to get Murdoch running the show and people like him. So you're going to get a privatized press, which just turns news bulletins into press releases for people like Big Pharma. I'm not saying the BBC didn't do some of this. Of course they did. But we desperately need some kind of state media, at least that's regulated in some way, to stop these barbarians, as they are, completely controlling what we see and hear. Otherwise, we're going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah. I'll give you the final word in a moment. I'm not sure about the BBC. Look, I know because it's a former parish, and I know what the BBC was meant to be and what it started out as. And RTE in Ireland, of course, took those values and took those qualities and set out on the same path. But of course, RTE ultimately became as bad as the BBC. And RTE today, I don't know how much of it you consume. I know you know all about it, but RTE is nothing but a mouthpiece for the establishment. It's all it does now. And that's how I see the BBC. Loads of interest in this conversation. Thank you for your messages. Tony's website, thisweek.org.uk, bilderberg.org. Got to get The Traders of Arnhem and Tony's other book and books. You've got to. It makes a lot of sense. It will make a lot of sense as you're reading it.
Okay, can I say something about before we go about Netanyahu? Because it's so important to remember that his follower killed the president back in 1995, Yitzhak Rabin, the Oslo peace negotiations. Accords, yeah. So this idea of assassinations. It's not just foreigners Netanyahu assassinates. He assassinates his own political leaders too. And I won't say it was definitely him that was in charge of that. He was obviously over in London, if people remember, on the 7/7 London bombings day, and he got a warning from his own embassy. Maybe he knew himself what was going on when these trains, 3 trains blew up and a bus blew up in London. And isn't it funny how he got a warning, no one else did? How strange. He didn't even tell Scotland Yard, so maybe he was actually in on it. There was an Israeli company that had just taken over, run by an ex-Israeli army officer, had just taken over all the CCTV coverage on all of the London tubes, and nothing was ever found on CCTV of any of these 4 alleged bombers on the tubes or on the buses. And so, these Israelis, I think you've got to be really, really careful, especially since they've been working in special forces as Netanyahu had. And the problem is the war crimes aren't being addressed. And if you don't address these war crimes through the international courts and get Netanyahu arrested and stuck in jail, they're just going to multiply. That's the way that they must be nipped in the bud, Richie. Otherwise, these war crimes are going to get worse and worse. And remember, up his sleeve, he's got between 200 and 250 nukes. To use whenever he feels like it.
You're right. Look, that's an hour. That's a good place to leave it. That was a power hour. You won't get any argument on from me on Netanyahu. Thanks, mate. I'm looking forward to the programme tomorrow about the planning, because it's massive. It spreads out that. It's like a pebble in a pond. It goes right into the green agenda and the climate change stuff, 2030. No doubt about it. That's thisweek.org.uk. Tony live tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Do not miss it. It's outstanding radio. They've always got wonderful guests on that know their stuff, that are very well briefed. So thanks for today, buddy. It's always a pleasure.
Okay. Cheers, Richie. God bless you and your listeners.
And you too, Tony. Tony Gosling, live from Bristol. Very generous with his time. Love that. Terrific bloke. As I said, thisweek.org.uk, bilderberg.org. The programme live tomorrow, 3 hours, packed with information, discussion, commentary that you really don't get anywhere else these days. So check it out. And The Traders of Arnhem is a wonderful read. I've got it here in the studio. A lot of comments to